She used to have, like a lot of people in this room, she used to have black hair, and now and she was the litter mate of my dad and mom's dog Maisie. So they were sisters, and we would bring them by, and they would play. There was another of their sisters that would come and hang out with them too. Dad loved Molly because Molly loved Dad. She would look at him just like she looked at me right there in his heart was melting. And so she wanted to be here for his services. Okay, well, I was walking Molly this morning, and those of you who walk dogs, there's two ways to walk dogs. One, you have a plan and a direction, and you know where you're going to go, and that's the way my dad was, right? To his sometimes disappointment, I'm the opposite way. I meander about, the dog's nose takes me where I need to go, just get its business done, and then I go back home. And so that's what I'm going to try to do with these remarks, is just meander about, not like Dad would do with a full plan. So on behalf of his kids, myself, his grandkids, I want to thank you guys for being here for his celebration of life. There's a lot more people than I expected. May not have prepared as much as I wanted to, but didn't expect a room of 100 people to talk to. If I maybe 20 or 25, I can wing it. So thank you guys for being here. It just shows how many of you that his life touched, along with ours. You know, Linda, who's been his hiking companion for so many years now, and so many of you that have been on these hikes with Dad, this was really the apex of his career. And he had, like a lot of you, these stages, and this was the final chapter, and it was a wonderful chapter for him. So hosting this here is really a big testament to what he went through. I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of his stories from his days in the military. Rob, my cousin right over there, he and I, right after my mom passed away last year, we sat around with a bottle of whiskey was it whiskey or bourbon?
Bourbon.
Bourbon. And he told us all kinds of stories, and I want to share a couple of them with you. So one of the things, if you read Laura's obituary, you saw he won all these medals of honor, and one of the ones was the Distinguished Flying Cross. I wanted to tell you how he earned that. The DFC was first awarded, in case you didn't know, in 1927 to Charles Lindbergh. Other recipients include George H.W. Bush, John McCain, Neil Armstrong, Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, and my personal favorite, Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek. So here's the story. So during a mission in Vietnam, Dad and his squad were doing what they do, and one of his squad went down. And so he finished out the mission, as you're supposed to, stayed in formation, came back to the base, but then he turned around and went back. And the reason he did this, he explained to Rob and I that night. Back then they had this policy, the Air Force, and it was a good policy, there were so many people going down there, this presumptive death policy that had good intentions. It aimed to prevent premature declarations of death and ensure accurate information about the fate of missing individuals. But unfortunately, if they didn't have visual confirmation, the family did not get death benefits. And they didn't know if their loved one was alive or dead. And so Dad flew back to get visual confirmation so that he could come back and the family could go on from there. So he did take some enemy fire. One of the things that we had in our collection was his, Brad probably knows what it's called, but the nose thing that kind of measures how fast you're going had a bullet in it. And so he made it back to the base, and he won the Distinguished Flying Cross. Another one of my favorite stories was when he was stationed in England, and he wasn't even allowed to talk about this. It was top secret, classified for years. It was a mission called Black Witch, which I thought would be a terrific name for a book or a movie. And they, the command brought him in and said, "John, this is a solo one-way mission. And if so asked, we have a F-4, we're going to put a tactical nuclear weapon on. You're going to fly under the radar to a target in the Soviet Union." This is Cold War. Those of you who are young enough to not know what I'm talking about. And one-way ticket, you just kind of drop your load and then you're done. Well, Dad, being the planner that so many of you know him to be, learned about where all of the air bases were in the section of Ukraine he was going to be in. He pulled a MiG flight manual so he could learn how to fly a MiG in case he did have to do this mission, he would be able to get back safely. So just like he would plan these hikes, he had a plan to get there and a plan to get back, even though really all he needed to do was the plan to get there. So that was another one of his stories. I know most of you have heard a lot of his tales from over the years. He was a great storyteller. He was a passionate debater of concepts and political and philosophical arguments. I think one of the things, he had 9 uncles, and they were all crazy West Texas people. And my aunt and uncle are here from New Mexico. They know what I'm talking about. They were all pretty crazy. And so I think he loved sitting around listening to his uncles debate, talk about things. And so us growing up, Rob and I, as cousins, we would grow up and listen to the same stories. Now my kids have to deal with Arvin and I arguing about Israel and Hamas and all that stuff. So it's just kind of carried on generation to generation. I think that like many of you, his dad's parents grew up in hard times. I mean, they were Depression era kids. They didn't grow up with a lot of the progressive psychological skills of how to invoke compassion and all of those things that you kind of look for in parents today. His parental model was basically, when he was growing up, being told what to do, right? That was kind of how a lot of you were raised. So he didn't always show the love and appreciation he had for his family, but I did want to just say a couple things to some of my siblings. So Angie, one of the things he just loved doing was sitting with you and talking. I think his favorite thing was making you laugh. And watching him sit with you and watching you laugh was one of the highlights of his life. And Laura, I spent a lot of time with him. He was so very proud of you. He would sit with me and, when I would come visit and talk about how proud he was of both of you. Really of all of us. And his grandkids, again, he may not have shown it the way that he would have liked to, but he really loved having you grandkids around for so much of his life. He didn't have that for a lot of his life, but then in the later years, you were there, and he was there for you, and he's so proud to have you part of it now. So it was 14 months ago, almost to the day, that I stood up to make some comments about my mom and her service. Many of you know that she battled cancer for about 3 years before she passed away last September. And my dad couldn't have been a better caretaker for her in those final months. He was there by her side. They were talking about all the wonderful times. You see the pictures of them all around the world, being an Air Force officer and getting to travel everywhere. They just sat and talked for hours. And he hated watching her die slowly. That was not what he wanted to do. When he was a kid in Phoenix, just a couple 100 miles west, Chuck Yeager was a test pilot breaking every speed record you could think of. And that was his model. That was who he wanted to be. That was his ambition as a test pilot. And those test pilots didn't have very long lives. Chuck Yeager was the exception, not the rule. And so he didn't want to linger. And in the end, he got his wish. He was diagnosed with cancer early in the summer and was gone by the fall. But before he died, he had one of his best days and months. One of the things that he organized with Linda was the Octo group for octogenarian hikes. And I think that one of his, probably the last 24 to 36 hours, he came out to meet a lot of you coming off the hike, sat in the grass, watched Penny play around, and ate pumpkin pie. And that was the way he wanted to go out. And so when we told Jack, my youngest over there, that his grandfather passed away, Jack just kind of nodded. This is total John Walters too, just kind of nodded and said, well, he had a pretty good run. Truer words are rarely spoken. Most of us would be lucky enough to have had one role we thrived at. Dad had many. He was a beloved son and sibling, husband, father, grandfather, gifted fighter pilot, successful businessman, dedicated volunteer. Thanksgiving is this week. Dad was very thankful of the life that he'd been granted, and we're all grateful that he was in our life. And this is a celebration of his life, and he would be right here celebrating with us. So thank you.